Going back to the beginning, we had a couple of questions that came up, right?
What would you like tell our viewers that if someone's dating and they meet this like man that they're like, or woman that they're super in love with, or like they can see like, I can see a future with this person. Would you tell them to wait? Because I am in some ways worried to give that advice to women because that is used to weaponize women about sex. And then sometimes I'm like, you know what? Sometimes you just have a one night stand and that's okay too.
Okay, so I'm going to speak as a man, and generally I'll speak to men. Why don't you speak to women?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's generally like, I don't know, I would say like it just depends with the partner. Like sometimes it's generally a good idea to wait and you should wait. And I waited with you, but I didn't wait with every other guy that I was dating. Some guys I slept with them for, like I met them and I slept with them within a span of a week. And sometimes like I also knew like it was just sex.
And that I think is, if you're going to ask me, I think that's one of the things. Like if it's just, it's going to be a hookup or whatever, like that's great. Like if that's what's fun for you, like for me, it's not necessarily my thing, in part because I find that sex generally gets better over time because you know my body more, I know your body more, and that to me is awesome. Like one of the great turn-ons for me is turning on my partner. And every partner I've had has, there are differences. There are things you get to know about the other's body, and I think that so there's that. So I agree with you. I wouldn't say like definitely don't do it or whatever, but I would also say, particularly to men, as where there's a lot of sort of social programming around like get it, get as much as you can, get it as soon as you can, that there's so much empowerment when it's not like I need to get laid, but I can actually have total composure and I can walk into it knowing that life is long and I don't have to get laid tonight or tomorrow or next week. Like I can actually build something else and use that sexual energy in other ways. So that's kind of what I would say. What about you?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. Like I would just be like, kind of like know when it's okay to like have sex earlier. And I would suggest like, I think I would advocate for waiting. But then I would also say like, if you don't wait, don't beat yourself up for it.
Yeah. I mean, like I've been at a party and had like a one night stand and it was awesome. And it was a lot of fun, but that's also not somebody I'm building a relationship with.
Yeah.
It was never going to be that. So in that case, that was fun. And
do you think you could have a one night stand with someone and then have a long term relationship with them?
Absolutely.
I think
Absolutely.
so too.
You can meet somebody and it's like, but there's not like a prescription, like do it this way.
Yeah.
But being conscious, that I think is really important. Of course, if you're at a party and you're getting drunk and you get laid, great. There's not going to bring a whole lot of consciousness into it because if we finish this bottle of wine, we might not have a whole lot of consciousness by the time we get to the end of this podcast
I
either. So that's great. But when there's consciousness, it's a different thing. Yeah.
I agree. So what else is we're going to talk about during Sex and Wine?
Sex and wine. Well, so I grew up in America. You grew up in Kenya.
Yeah.
Was sex talked about in your family at all?
Never. I didn't even know anything about sex. Like, I remember asking my mom, like, where she got me. And she said she bought me in a supermarket. I'm not kidding.
Because that's easier than talking about sex.
Yes. She was like, I bought you at a supermarket.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, literally.
And at what age did you stop believing that?
Late.
You're like, wait a second.
Okay, so for me, I've been a late bloomer in like a lot of stuff, so I didn't get my period until I was 16. I didn't start having sex until I was 20. Like I was old when I started having sex. Like, and I wouldn't even call like
20 is it's probably beyond the average in a lot of places, but I'm sure there are definitely plenty of people where that's totally acceptable.
That's true. I just kind of feel like in the society that I live now, it's like girls have sex earlier than when they're 20, 21. Yeah, but I never discuss sex at home. Never. I just never even had anyone discussing sex.
Yeah.
You know?
So it wasn't except what? So, but it came. Everything you got was friends or
there was
cousins?
like something different when my stepdad, when I got my period for the first time, I didn't know what was happening because no one talked to me about sex. No one talked to me about having a period. So when I got my period at 16, I saw like this red, black thing on my panties, and I like went to him and I told him, and like I can still, he's dead, God bless his soul, but I can still see his face. He was mortified that he had to answer those questions for me. And I was in so much pain too. And he was just like, I don't know what to do. He bought me like Panadol, which is like Advil. And then my mom came and she was just like, put this pad. And then I think what she told me was like, now you gotta be really careful around boys because you can get a baby. That was the
like,
extent of.
That was it.
That was it. And then people around me was just like, now people around me started monitoring me with playing with boys because now I was a young, I guess, looking back, I was a young girl who would get pregnant.
So you went from being a girl to a young woman.
Correct. And people were monitoring like my behavior, you know? So I remember like one of our neighbors was just like, don't play with boys past dark. And I was like, wait, why not? I was doing this exact thing last week and no one said anything, you know?
So then it was kind of like, it was almost like through the grapevine. Everyone knows like Cera had her period now.
Yeah. And like,
She can't play with boys.
And I think like that's kind of like one of the things like especially where I grew up is like the child belonged to the community. So I was a young woman who like everyone was like monitoring, but they weren't like necessarily talking to me about it.
Right.
You know, and like I remember my cousin was the one who's like first talking to me about sex, but not at home.
And then you're like, oh, so maybe I wasn't bought in a supermarket.
I'm not kidding. I think my mom would tell me even today, like,
I think your mother would much rather tell you that you were bought in a supermarket today than tell you anything that had to do with sex.
seriously, like,
You're like, no, well, we're going to keep that to that first story. Like, I've thought it long enough. If you say something and believe something long enough, it becomes absolutely true.
yeah, true.
You know, my
What
family
about you?
also, like, terribly disappointing, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
In the United States?
In the United States with a very liberal, like socially liberal parents.
They did not talk to you about sex?
No, it was actually very challenging when I came of sexual age. I feel like it was a major hole in my like development as a young man. Yeah, like I had sex before I knew really what an orgasm was. Because I was definitely like interested. I knew it was like I seemed like I was kind of like I was the cool, you know, in some ways, like I seemed very worldly. I traveled a lot. But nobody had ever talked to me about it. And so I had no idea, you know, and I can miss sex ed. Lived in Mexico in 8th grade. And so I had sex ed in 8th grade in Spanish when I had just moved to Mexico, and I didn't understand what was going on. So the boys went together and they were drawing something like anatomy, something, and like it made no sense to me. And my dad avoided it, and I talked to him about it much later. He was like, you know, it was like my parents had to sit down with me. It was so awkward. I was like, I'm never going to subject my kids to that.
Oh, so his parents sat down with him.
And he was like, and it was just it was like, you know, it was the 1960s or, you know, early 60s or something, right? And he was just like, it was just uncomfortable and awkward. And, you know, it was like, I didn't want to do that to you. But then I was like, I'm going out in the world and I don't know how to put on a condom. I'm like, I just didn't know anything. I literally did not know anything about sex. And I was actually, like, I basically learned on the job. It was on the job training, which is a really bad way to learn about sex.
It's a really bad way to learn, you know,
like don't learn on the job. Like that's one where, you know, there are some professions where it's a really good idea. Like you could hurt somebody if you don't. And it's kind of like, we wonder why kids get, or having, whether they're pregnant or STDs or any kind of, sexual bullying or sexual misconduct or, molestation or all these other negative things that can happen. And not to say that pregnancy is bad, but teenage pregnancy is certainly, an issue, a big issue because you have like kids having kids. We're not talking about these things, and And like there's to have that conversation, and if knowledge is power, without the knowledge you don't have the power.
No.
And so I like that was a big hole in an otherwise, like, I feel like my childhood was pretty good. I feel like my parents did a pretty good job, and that was a big issue.
Oh, I'm surprised.
Yeah.
I actually didn't know this before this podcast right now, that I just assumed that knowing your dad and knowing who your mother was, that they would have talked to you about sex.
It still surprises me to this
That
day.
they
It
chose
still
not
surprises
to.
me to this day. But that was it, and I had to learn the way I learned. But I could have gotten myself into trouble for sure. Whether it was pregnancy or STDs, or just like being inappropriate with myself, letting myself be treated poorly, treating other people poorly. I just had no idea. Like all of the stuff that's been coming up in the last couple of years around consent, around talking about it. I have 4 daughters. It's like, wow, if parents of sons aren't talking to their sons, that's a big problem, because now all of the onus continues to fall on girls and women to be able to protect themselves, to be able to make the smart choices, rather than empowering our boys. And we need to empower everyone, empower girls and boys. Knowledge is power, and sex is always going to be a part of most people's lives.
I know. My first sex class, like actual sex class with consent, I landed when I went to college, and I went to college old. I think I was 26 when I first sat down with like a counselor, and like they talked about consent and sex. And I was just like mind blown. Like, I'm 26 fucking years old. Like I was just like, I should know this, but I didn't. So it's always, it's like, now I've made it like part of like my mission. When young women talk to me about sex, I'm just like, put it on the table.
Yeah.
Like, do you want to have sex? Do you know like how to have protected sex, and like put just all of it?
Yeah. And even if I'm like talking with younger people too, it's, it's both really important, because you have to like respect yourself and all these things. It's both important, and then it's also like not that big of a deal at the same time. It's like, it's really important. It's a big deal. And it's also not that big of a deal. Like if your first time you have sex, like actually one of my daughter's friends was like, I just had sex young because I just wanted to get it over with. Because this whole anticipation, whatever, just now I don't have first time anymore. Now I can be relaxed about it, because our culture has a lot of stuff around the first time. I think probably more for girls than for boys.
Yeah, I remember my cousin who talked to me about sex had like the best idea, not the best advice that I've received around sex. And she said, if you ever had sex with someone and you wake up and you make the choice to have sex with them, when you wake up the next day, don't regret it. Move on.
That is very, very good advice.
Learn from it. And she's just like, as a young woman, I had sex with people, and then I lived the rest of my life regretting it. And it's just like, I'm not going to go back. Like, forgive yourself, learn from it, move on. And I just decided, if I choose to have sex with someone, I tell myself I'm not, like the next day, I was not going to regret about it.
Good idea.
But now I only have sex with you.
Well, that makes it easy. And so far, any regrets?
Not really.
Okay.